wasting much of time, I request
and holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree and a Bachelor of Laws from Mumbai University. He was a partner in JASS and Company LLP Chartered Accountants handling the direct tax litigation. He has more than a decade of qualification experience of direct tax litigation, which includes the representation before the tax authorities, income tax appellate tribunal on a regular basis. He specializes in the area of international taxation, transfer pricing, FEMA, and other allied fiscal laws like Benami prohibition laws, black money laws, prevention of money laundering laws. He has been awarded a proficiency certificate of merit by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India for securing AIR 1 in the tax management course. He also holds a diploma in the international taxation and has a secured AIR 2 in DIT exams conducted by the ICAI. He has also delivered sessions on the FEMA and the direct tax in various events and the meeting organized by the branches and study circle of ICI and BCS. He has also authored various articles on the subject matter of a professional interest. I would now request Ravi Soni to give a memento to Jigar and Shayan. And request Shreyas to give the receipt of benevolent funds. I now request Mr. Jigar Mehta to take over and take the sessions.
Good evening. Hello. So, good evening, members. So I was just trying to factor in whether all those jalebi fafadas have, synced in properly. So, yeah, fine. Good afternoon, everybody. So it's a pleasant experience here delivering on this topic, salaries and ESOPs under Income Tax Act 2025. And in fact, it was a much more pleasant experience to hear Bhadresh Bhai this morning on 45.4. This was the second time that I heard him on 45.4, and every time I hear him, it's a new angle that I get. So thank you for this opportunity. So coming to this topic, I was a bit fumbled when I got this topic because the topic was salaries and ESOPs under Income Tax Act 2025. This Income Tax Act 2025 created a confusion in my mind as to whether there is anything that has undergone a change under Income Tax Act 2025. Because every time we hear the finance ministry, every time we hear the conferences of Prarambh being organized by the income tax department, one thing is very common, that nothing has changed in the Income Tax Act except for the language. So therefore I was just wondering as to whether there is any change per se in the taxation of salaries and ESOPs insofar as Income Tax Act 2020-25 vis-a-vis 1961 is concerned. So I'll focus today's discussion on four broad aspects. The first one being the major changes in IT Act 1961 versus IT Act 2025. The second one being salary related changes related to allowances, perquisites, etc. in the Income Tax Act 2025. The third one being what are share based payments. There are multiple modes of making share based payments. And lastly, what is the taxation of various share based payments both for the employee as well as the employer. So this is what we'll cover today. We have already discussed this. So now we move on to a broad comparison of what is it under IT Act 1961 versus IT Act 2025. So largely nothing changes. Everything that was there in 1961, in fact I would believe salary and house property, these are the two most unlitigated avenues in IT Act 2025, because what happens is they have not changed the language also too much. For example, capital gain, even though their intent was to keep the same, but the language change has resulted in some absurdity. But for salary and house property, I largely believe that such a consequence is only at one or two places. Otherwise, largely what was there in 61 continues in 2025. Having said that, they have definitely renumbered the sections that we are all aware of. So charging section continues to be section 15. There is no material change in section 15, except one small change. These changes are not very relevant, so I'm not included in my slides. I'll just narrate it over the discussion. So one change in section 15 is that earlier they had it used to say employer or former employer. Now they have removed the word former employer, and at one particular subsection they have defined employer to mean former employer also, to include former employer also. So besides that, there is no change in section 15 is concerned. I'll go to deductions a bit later. Before that, definition of salary, perquisites, profit in lieu of salary continues to remain the same, that is section 16, 17, 18. Section 19 is deductions from salary. So we had three deductions from salary earlier. One was entertainment allowance, second was entertainment allowance was only for government employees, then we had profession tax, then we had standard deduction. These were the three deductions that we had in the IT Act 1961. Now these deductions list has now increased, and this is something that even I checked when I prepared this PPT. So entertainment allowance no longer continues as a deduction, but there are certain other items that have been added to deductions that we discuss in the next slide, and what is the impact of inclusion of those deductions. Besides that, we have TDS on salary, which was earlier governed by section 192, which now gets governed by section 392. And definitely there are changes in form for filing TDS returns on salary and TDS certificate on salary. So the earlier form 16 now becomes form 130. So this is what section 15 of IT Act 2025 states. The following income shall be chargeable to tax under the head salaries. First is any salary due, whether paid or not. So it is on due basis. Any salary paid or allowed, whether or not due or before it was due. Any arrears of salary paid or allowed if not charged to income tax for any earlier previous year. So here what happens is, ideally any salary either which is due or received in advance, paid in arrears, everything gets taxed in section 15. So even advance salary gets covered in section 15. This was the law even under the earlier provision and is the law even in the current provision. So therefore, this is what is with respect to chargeability of salary. Now one question that arises is whether salary remuneration received by partner of a firm is also taxable as salary within the meaning of section 15 of ITA. So it gets covered under section 28. ITA 2025, there is a specific subsection, I think it's subsection 6, which says that remuneration paid to partner of a firm shall not be chargeable to tax under the head income from salary, and therefore income or remuneration paid to partner of a firm will get excluded from the present discussion. And this is what I was referring to. So you had this is a comparative mechanism of how would you compute salary income under IT Act 1961 versus IT Act 2025. So you had salaries, allowances, pensions, perquisites, profit in lieu of salary, etc., which would all add up. Then you would have had exemptions, certain exemptions under section 1013, certain exemptions under 1013A, certain. Then you had gratuity, pension, leave encashment, which were also exempted under section 10. And then you had deductions, as I said, employment tax, standard deduction, profession tax. Now here if you see, earlier gratuity, pension, leave salary, retrenchment compensation, etc. was exempt under section 10. What has been done under ITA 2025 is they've been removed from exemptions and they have been moved to deductions. So now let us first deliberate as to what is the impact of moving a particular item from exemptions to deduction. So what is the basic difference between an exemption and a deduction? Sorry? Correct. 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 So exemption is, if we refer the earlier section 10, it says income not includable in the total income. So those were items which never entered the computation mechanism. Whereas deductions is something that is allowed as a specific deduction. So once it is included in the income, then you deduct. For example, if we refer the most simple example, you have business income. Under business income, suppose you earn profit from share of profit from a partnership firm. It is exempt, so it does not enter your computation mechanism. However, the deductions under section 28 to 37 are deductions wherein you get some deductions based on what is provided in the law. So now, as such, this may not have a big impact, but possibly there is some intention of moving it to deduction and it may result into some absurdity. So deductions as such, for example, if in a particular case you have a case where an employee has received only gratuity during the year. For example, let us consider that during a particular year the employee resigned, say, in the month of March. In the month of April he received only gratuity. That gratuity gets taxed to him as per the provisions of section 17. Now once it is included there, when you come to deductions, you would apply deductions for gratuity and you will also apply a deduction for standard deduction. So therefore there is a possibility that under the head salary there would be a loss, though if you refer the other provisions of that, there is no mention of loss under the head salary. But computationally it is a possibility now under the ITA 2025 that you would have a situation where there is a loss in the case of salary income as well. Why is it so? Because suppose a person receives 8 lakh as gratuity. That entire amount is eligible for deduction under the new provisions. We are all aware as to what is, so 15 by 26, payment of gratuity act ke hisab se we have to compute. So we compute the entire amount is deductible as gratuity. However, standard deduction is something that is not linked to other deductions. So standard deduction states 75,000 or the amount of salary whichever is less. Now salary is in any case 8 lakhs. So 8 lakhs or 75,000 whichever is less. So it is 75,000. So therefore you will get standard deduction on an item which is completely deductible. So therefore I am not very particularly sure why they have moved it to deductions, but there is an absurdity when you would enter a computation mechanism where ultimately there will be a loss. Now with coming to other aspects of perquisites. So these are again, this is not anything to do with IT Act per se. All of these has been amended in the IT rules. So and these are all again limit increases, but I feel that there is a considerable provision to structure your salary in a fashion that using these perquisites or allowances you can structure your salary to maximize the or minimize the tax implication in the hands of employee, alongside not casting any additional obligation on the employer. So these were the earlier limits. And so see, this is okay, one more thing. When we discuss perquisites, perquisite valuation, benefit or taxation applies in both cases, old scheme as well as new scheme. So if you were to value perquisites, if you were to take certain benefits under the perquisite taxation, it applies to both the schemes, new scheme of taxation as well as the old scheme of taxation. Whereas allowances are exempt only and only if you opt for old scheme. Correct? So perquisites, we'll first move on to perquisites. So first is motor car related perquisite, where the motor car is owned or hired by the employer and is used partly for official and partly for personal purposes. So here the perquisite values are mentioned under ITA 1961, where the expenses on maintaining and running the car was met by the employer. Earlier 1800 used to be charged as the perquisite value. Now that value has been increased to 3000. Similarly, if the cubic capacity of the car was greater than 1.6 liters, then 2400 earlier it was, now it has been increased to 7000. And this is where the expenses were made by the employer. If the expenses are made by the employee, earlier for cubic capacity less than or equal to 1.6 liters it was 600, which has now increased to 2000, and for cubic capacity exceeding 1.6 liters 900 has increased to 3000. Besides that, if there is a chauffeur, the 900 car chauffeur has increased to 3000. So what happens is, if an employer gives a motor car which is used partly for personal and partly for personal purposes, only 5000 gets taxed, irrespective of the amount of expenditure actually incurred by the employer. So a car is owned by the employer, it is used for partly official purpose and partly personal purpose of the employee, and the expenses of running the car are met by the employer. Then irrespective of the actual amount of expenditure, only this amount of 5000 or 7000 as the case may be gets taxed in the hands of employee. Okay. Similar is a case where you have concessional or free education. If the employer enters into an arrangement, I have changed it here. Okay. So similar is a case of free or concessional educational facilities, where the educational institute is either maintained and owned by the employer, or where an employer enters into an arrangement with certain other educational institute. There, in that case, earlier the cost of such education less the amount recovered was considered as perquisite. It continues the same. However, earlier, if the value of such education was less than rupees 1000 per month per child, then it was not taxable as perquisite. That has increased to 3000 per month. So that is one benefit that they have given. Okay, third one is a significant one, in a sense that practically a lot of times what happens is employers do give loans to employees. As a matter of fact, what is required to be done is the interest amount has to be computed with respect to the loan amount, and whatever is the interest amount, that is to be based on SBI PLR, whatever is the interest amount is to be included as the perquisite value in the hands of the employee. This was not being done very often, but the law existed even then, that if any interest free loan is given to employee, then a notional interest has to be computed and has to be included in the perquisite valuation of the employee. Earlier, if the loan amount was up to 20,000, no perquisite valuation was required to be computed. Now that limit of 20,000 has been increased to rupees 2 lakh, and therefore if the loan, interest free loan, is below 2 lakhs, there is no requirement of taxing any perquisite. Again, so this is with respect to free food or non-alcoholic beverages. Earlier what happened is, if 50 rupees per meal was the value which was provided that if during the working hours employees were either provided with meals or vouchers, then the same was not considered as perquisite if the value of per meal was rupees less than 50. Now that limit has increased to rupees 200 per meal. Similarly, you had a case where gifts given to employees. Earlier, gifts to the extent of 5,000 given to employee were not considered as perquisite. Now, if the value of gift is up to 15,000, it will not be considered as perquisite. Mind you, for both serial number 4, serial number 5, or even the other items that we considered, if the value exceeds the amount that we are discussing, the entire amount gets taxed at perquisite and not only the excess amount. So this is one thing that has to be borne in mind. So insofar as these items, serial number 1 to 5 that we have discussed are concerned, this will apply to either old scheme or new scheme. In both these schemes you can avail of these tax benefits. Now with respect to allowances, this is applicable only and only if you opt for old scheme and not under the new scheme. So earlier you had child education allowance, which allowed you an exemption of 100 rupees per month per child. For if an employer gives child education allowance, so per child 100 rupees, maximum 2 children, 100 rupees per month per child. Now that limit has increased to 3,000 per month per child. Similarly, allowance granted to an employee to meet hostel expenditure of the child. Earlier it was 300 per month per child, that has increased to 9,000 per month per child. So that is a change that they have done. Third is leave travel allowance. Earlier it was that whatever be the employee, be he the managing director, be he the peon, be he whatever, the amount of leave travel allowance he was allowed was economy class fare. Now they have stated it is lower of entitled class fare or actual amount spent. So they have stated entitled class fare. So entitled class fare is something that the employer may decide for each category of employee as to what is his entitlement person. Okay, with this we move on to the very spoke about amendment that HRA, they have included 4 new cities, Hyderabad, Pune, Ahmedabad and Bangalore, wherein, so when you compute HRA exemption, earlier it was 50% of basic in only 4 cities, that is Mumbai, Kolkata, Delhi and Chennai, and for all other cities it was 40% of the basic. Now they have changed this to 50% for 4 more cities, Hyderabad, Pune, Ahmedabad and Bangalore. So if you are staying in any of these cities, you will be entitled to 50% of basic as your HRA exemption. With this they have also made one amendment in the forms. I am not sure, I don't think it affects anything except for disclosure. So when an employee claims exemptions, allowances or deductions, he has to furnish form 12BB under the earlier act. Now in this form 12BB, which is now replaced by form 124, they have mandated a disclosure, that is what is the relationship with the landlord. Earlier this disclosure was not required. So therefore when an employee files a declaration with the employer with respect to HRA deduction that he has paid so and so rent, he is also required to explain his relationship with the landlord. Now does this, okay, one more important fact is this is only employee declaring to the employer. Employer, when he files TDS return, this disclosure is not required. Secondly, is the law amended to say that rent paid to relatives will not be allowed? The answer is no. So therefore this is possibly with an intention, that when you make a declaration and if you give a relative and you are trying to claim a fake deduction, they want to prevent. But merely by this declaration, I don't think that either the employer nor the tax officer per se, only on the basis of this declaration, would be eligible to deny you the deduction for HRA, exemption for HRA. Okay, with this we move on to the last part dealing with salary, and which is perquisite. So we had this okay, one important way of again structuring salary used to be, and which is even till today, One way is if the employee is not interested in receiving the funds immediately, you can increase employer's contribution to PF or other funds like NPS superannuation fund. What happens is if the employer's contribution to these funds increases, it does not get taxed in the hands of the employee. Correct? Is everyone with me? Because any contribution made by an employer to an employee welfare fund is not includable in the salary. What happened is, this used to happen without any limit. I think 4 or 5 years back, they brought in a limit of 7,50,000. So therefore, all this put together, your contribution of employer cannot exceed 7,50,000. If it exceeds 7,50,000, it will be considered as a perquisite and get taxed in the hands of the employee. So far so good. Here possibly the language change has resulted into some absurdity. Earlier it stated that perquisite includes so and so, so and so, so and so, to the extent it exceeds 7,50,000 in a previous year. So therefore, if someone paid 9 lakh as a contribution and as per this it is only 7,50,000, the balance 1,50,000 will be includable as perquisite and get taxed in the hands of the employee. Now if you refer 17.1, it says for the purpose of this part, aggregate amount of any contribution in excess of 7,50,000 in a tax year. Here there is a possibility to argue that if the contribution exceeds 7,50,000, the aggregate amount would get taxed. So for example, if 9 lakh, same situation, when it is possible for the department to contend that 9 lakh would get taxed as the perquisite valuation. Sorry. Correct, but aggregate. So any contribution in excess of, so the point is whether the contribution in excess of 7,50,000 or amount in excess of 7,50,000 is the way you would read it. So if I were to read it contribution in excess of 7,50,000, then aggregate amount if the contribution is in excess of 7,50,000. So this is insofar as this is concerned. Now with this we'll move on to the next part of our discussion, which is employee share based payments. So first, we'll discuss as to what are certain employee share based payments. So the first and the most common form of employee share based payment is employee stock option plan or employee stock option scheme. Now what is an employee stock option scheme? Yeah, ESOP. So ESOP is a scheme where the company grants a right but not an obligation to the employee to subscribe to its shares at a predetermined price. So there are a few things that are essential. One is it should be by the employer. Either the securities are allotted or the securities are transferred, and the company has given an option to the employee that he may subscribe to the shares of the company at a predetermined or a discounted price. Therefore, the price and everything is decided. Next is an employee stock purchase plan. Now, this is a company sponsored program by which employees can purchase the shares of their own company at a discount. This is usually by way of payroll deductions. So what happens is when you get a salary slip, out of your total salary a particular amount gets deducted and goes towards investment in the shares of the company. So that is employee share purchase plan. Next is RSUs. Now RSUs represents company shares which are not granted upfront, but the ownership is transferred after specific vesting conditions are met. So these stock units do not give you rights like that of shares, but they give you specific rights with respect to the purchase. For example, capital appreciation, dividends, etc. Then you have restricted stock awards, wherein what happens is RSA is a grant of company stock in which the recipient rights remains restricted until the shares vest. So what happens is the company has granted the shares, but till the time of vesting, the rights do not transfer to the employee. So that is RSA. Then you have stock appreciation rights, wherein actually employee does not get anything except a right to claim whatever is the appreciation in stock. So for example, if I am an employee of a say listed company, the price of the shares of that company is say 120 rupees today. When I am granted a SAR today, what I get is, say after 3 years the price of the shares reaches 150 for example, I am entitled to that 30 as an entitlement from the company. Now there can be two ways that I can receive this 30. One is either in cash, which is called as cash settled SARs, or other is equity settled SARs, wherein I would receive वो 30 का equivalent equity shares and not the entire this thing. So these are SARs. One new concept that is, honestly I have not seen much in Indian companies, but a lot of overseas companies using them, is phantom stock plans, wherein what happens is you grant stocks to the employees which do not form part of the share capital of the company. So these are phantom stocks which entitle you to the right to all the rights as that of a shareholder, except that you become a shareholder of the company. But you have the right to receive dividends. You have the right to whenever you transfer this phantom stock to certain, the price at which the equity shares are traded, you will get the same price. So these are phantom stock plans. So that is the last category. Now typically let us understand what an ESOP life cycle looks like. Fine. I think the technician has not yet been granted ESOP, so he's not yet fully motivated. स्विच ऑफ हो गया क्या? Okay, so we were on to ESOP life cycle as to what a typically ESOP life cycle looks like. So the first step in a ESOP life cycle is that the company grants an ESOP. So the first step is that the company would have to declare that it is intending to launch an ESOP scheme. So that is known as grant of ESOP. Then those ESOP would have certain vesting conditions that the employee has to, say for example, be associated with the company for a period of 3 years or so. So that is the period which is known as the vesting period. And the date on which the employee is entitled to exercise his option is called as the vesting date. Now after the vesting date, there is normally a window in which the employee can exercise his option, which is known as the exercise period. The date on which the employee is allotted shares is definitely the allotment date. Once the shares are allotted to an employee, it is his property. He can deal or dispose of that property in as per his choice, unless there is some lock-in conditions. So that is finally he can sell his exercised options. So this is the basic understanding of how an ESOP works. Now let us come to the tax implication. So we saw that there were multiple dates. One was grant date, one was vesting date, one was exercise date, and finally was the sale date. So we have to examine the tax implications of ESOP firstly in the hands of employee with respect to each of these dates. So let us consider grant date, or we'll move on to the provisions and then we'll discuss as to how it gets taxed. So first of all, whether it gets taxed is the question. So is everyone at consensus that it gets taxed? Okay. So why it gets taxed? Until 2000, there was no taxation, or there was limited taxation of ESOPs. Or for example, ESOPs could be structured in a way that they would not get taxed, because there was no specific provision under the Act to tax ESOPs. It fell in the residuary category of perquisites, wherein perquisites included any value of any cash or asset that was granted by the company to the employee. Then now, I mean in 1961 and 2025 Act, perquisite specifically includes the value of any specified security or sweat equity shares allotted or transferred directly or indirectly by the current employer or former employer, free of cost or at concessional rate to the assessee. So we'll decipher this taxing provision. We'll discuss as to what is value, what is specified security equity shares, what is meant by allotted or transferred, what is directly indirectly, employer we are aware of, and free of cost or concessional we are aware of. So first we decide as to what is value. So 17(4)(h) defines value to mean fair market value of the specified security or sweat equity shares on the date on which the option is exercised by the assessee. So what is the value? Because what is to be taxed is value. So what is value? Value is fair market value of the specified security on the date on which option is exercised by the assessee, as reduced by the amount. So if employee pays certain amount, that amount has to be reduced. Now what is fair market value? Because it says fair market value of the specified security. So what is fair market value? So fair market value is defined to mean value as determined in accordance with the method as may be prescribed. So we move on to what is the method that is prescribed. I'll just move this slide. Okay. So this is what has been prescribed. So rule 15 subclause 6, rule 15 deals with valuation of perquisite. Under the earlier law we had rule 3 which dealt with valuation of various perquisites. Now under 2025 we have rule 15 which deals with valuation of perquisite, and rule 15 subclause 6 deals with valuation of shares that are issued consequent to a ESOP scheme. So you have two shares that can be valued. One is equity shares, other is other than equity shares. So for equity shares, again you have either you will have a listed shares or an unlisted shares. For listed shares, we will first go to listed shares. So for listed shares, if it is listed on a recognized stock exchange, it is the average of the opening and the closing price on the recognized stock exchange. So whatever is the price of the share when the shares are allotted, that is the date on which the option is exercised by the employee, whatever is the opening and the closing price on the stock exchange, average of that is considered as the fair market value. Now what happens if on that day the shares are not traded? Then what you have to do is you have to take a date which is immediately preceding that date, and you have to see the closing price, not the average, the closing price on the date immediately preceding the date on which the shares are on which the option is exercised by the employer. Now one more possibility is what happens if there are multiple stock exchanges on which a particular share is listed. Then you have to consider, in both these methods you have to consider the stock exchange on which there is highest volume of trade recorded. So if the shares is listed on BSE as well as NSE, you would refer volume कहाँ पे ज़्यादा है, and accordingly you will determine what is the method of which stock exchange price is to be referred. Now again, what is opening and closing price? It is the last settlement price. However, if the stock exchange quotes both buy and sell price, you have to see the last sell price on which the settlement has taken place. So this is insofar as listed shares is concerned. Now with respect to unlisted shares or shares other than equity shares, and you know these days it happens more so that startups would normally provide ESOP because they are one, you know, who are in cash crunch or otherwise, they normally prefer granting ESOPs. So what happens if the shares are not listed, or that the shares that are granted are, say for example CCPS, then what is to be done is you are required to determine valuation compulsorily by a category 1 merchant banker. You don't have an option, you have to value the shares, you have to obtain a valuation report from a merchant banker as of the specified date. Now what is the specified date? Specified date is the date of exercising option or any earlier date not being more than 180 days from the date of exercising of the option. So therefore for listed shares you have to take compulsorily the exercise date ka valuation, but for unlisted shares or shares other than equity shares, you can take a valuation report from a merchant banker which is 180 days prior to the date of exercise. The valuation has to be 180 days prior to the date of exercise, not the date of report. The date of report is definitely not relevant, but the valuation should be determined either on the date of exercise or 180 days prior to that. So that is how you will determine value. Now once you have determined value, the next step is we go back to the definition. So you determine what is taxable is value. How the value is to be determined we have undergone. There are some nuances in terms of value that we will discuss in the next part of it. Then what should be received? Either a specified security or a sweat equity shares which have been allotted or transferred. So what is specified security or sweat equity shares? That again has been defined in the IT Act itself. And specified security is defined to mean security as defined in 2H of SCRA, and where ESOP has been granted under a plan or a scheme thereof includes security offered under such plan or scheme. So a specified security is a security which is provided in 2H of SCRA. So we have to examine that whether everything, for example, as I said SAR. So in case of a SAR, what the employee gets is a right to appreciation of the price of the shares that are listed. He does not get the share per se. There is no allotment of shares, but he is getting a right or an entitlement to appreciation to the share price of a particular company. So we have to determine whether SAR per se would fall under, or for any other matter, for see shares, debentures, etc. would definitely get covered. I have quoted the definition under 2H of SCRA, which says shares, scripts, etc. etc. But whether SAR would get covered under specified security. So here there are 2 points which are to be noted. One is security under SCRA is defined in an inclusive manner, because it says securities include, and therefore one would have to examine whether anything which is not listed here would also be security. And the answer to that question is yes. But whether any and everything would be securities, the answer is no. So anything that is generally perceived as a security can be considered as a security. Now, and if you see, it has to be, again you have to follow the principle of nocere sauces, which is the words would take the color on the basis of other items. So it has shares, scripts, stocks, bonds, debentures, all of this is okay. Or other marketable securities of a like nature in or of any incorporated company or a body corporate. So it has to give you rights which are similar to shares or debentures. A SAR normally per se would not give you a right which is similar to that of shares, debentures, bonds, etc. And therefore SAR per se would not be covered under the definition of securities. Then you have derivatives, mutual funds, etc. You will not find any of them. But clause 3, if you refer, it says rights or interests on securities. Now whether SAR gives you a right or interest in security. Now what is meant by rights or interest in securities? For example, you don't take a share, but you get a warrant. That gives you a right or interest in the security. That gets covered under clause 3. But whether SAR gives you a right in the security, the answer is no. You would not be entitled to claim a share from the company in view of the SAR that you get. And therefore, it does not get covered under clause 3 also. And therefore, if we refer this in entirety, we can come to a conclusion that stock appreciation rights per se would not get covered, would not get taxed under this particular provisions of the Act. Okay, next is sweat equity shares. Sweat equity shares means equity shares issued by the company to its employees or directors at discount or for consideration other than cash for providing know-how or making available rights in the nature of IPR or value additions by whatever name called. So this is simple. So either specified securities or shares. Next is allotted or transferred. So there are 2 ways in which an employee can get ESOP. One is either the company would allot those shares, or the company or its promoters would transfer the shares to the employee or a trust who would then transfer it to the employee. So both of these is covered, either allotted or transferred. Directly or indirectly. What is meant by directly or indirectly? Directly means the company directly giving to the employee. Indirectly means company setting up a trust and trust in turn giving it to a employee. So in essence, everything does get covered under this. Now, okay. Now, so what happens is, I'll just move to the next slide. Okay. So this is the slide that I was referring to. At the time of grant of stock options, there is no tax implication, because what the employee receives is nothing but merely a hope. At the time of vesting also, there is no taxation, because the employee has received the right, but until and unless he exercises that right, he has not received any real income. At the time of exercise, the value of the security gets taxed in the hands of the employee as perquisite. And this is the time when employer will also have to deduct TDS. What is the taxation we discussed? FMV on the exercise price less the exercise price. Then what happens is at the time of sale there is a taxation, which is the capital gains because the employee has sold his shares. So whatever is the capital, whatever is the sale consideration less the cost of acquisition gets taxed to him in his hands as capital gains. Here, however, what is the cost of acquisition? So for cost of acquisition, we move on to section 73(1) of the ITA 2020-25, which says that the cost is the fair market value taken into account for the purpose of perquisite valuation. So whatever was offered as perquisite, that FMV is the cost of the asset, which when sold will be considered as cost. What is the period of holding? The date on which the securities are allotted. So that is insofar as the tax implication in the hands of employee are concerned. Sorry. So what happens is once you get an once the share this has been exercised, you have right to those shares. You may receive it afterwards. So for example, I would place it as simply as this, that suppose if I have some receivable from a particular person, that taxation would happen when I receive or when it becomes receivable. In my opinion, it would become when I get a right to receive, which is the concept of accrual common under Income Tax Act. So when I exercise the right, I get an that income accrues to me in terms of section 5, and accordingly it should be taxable in the year of exercise. No, here it is. So it says the value of any specified security or equity shares allotted or transferred. So this talks about value of shares allotted or transferred, which I am not denying. But the year of taxation would be governed by, not by this section, but by section 15 read with section 5 of that. This does not provide the timing of taxation per se. The timing would come from section 15 read with section 5. Next is tax implication in the hands of employer. Now what happens in the hands of employer? Should the employer be allowed deduction in the same year as that when it is getting taxed in the hands of employee as perquisite? The answer is no. First of all, whether it is allowable to the employer is the question. So employer, the provisions are governed under section 28 to 37. 28 to 36 are specific provisions dealing with certain deductions. None of these sections would cover a situation of ESOP. So therefore ESOP cost would come under section 37, and we are required to determine whether ESOP is allowable as an expenditure under section 37 of the Act. Now ideally there was a lot of litigation around this. You had Delhi ITAT in the case of, I don't remember the citation, but there was a Delhi ITAT which had ruled against the assessee, stating that ESOP cost per se is not allowable to the employer as a deduction because it is in the nature of capital expenditure. It had interpreted it in a fashion that it is a cost of capital because ultimately your share capital is increasing and you are taking less amount from the persons from whom you are subscribing those shares. So that is a cost which is related to the capital, and accordingly it is not allowed as a deduction to the employer. Ultimately a special bench was constituted in case of Biocon, and you know that is the Bible when we discuss ESOP taxation in terms of employer as to what is the deduction, because it is a wonderful judgment. It is one of the author of the judgment is the president, past president of Honorable ITAT, and it's a wonderful judgment wherein they have dealt everything and anything with respect to employer taxation. So first thing that it states is, I'll just move on, so we'll just move on to that and then come here. So whether any deduction on any such discount under ESOP is allowable. The ITAT, so there were multiple arguments raised by the department. The tribunal negated all that arguments and held that one thing that is important is expenditure need not necessarily be incurred in cash. The incurrence of an obligation is also an expenditure. So what the tribunal said is, it is not mandatory that either I have to pay in cash or check to a person to claim an expenditure. If I incur an obligation, that also is an expenditure for me and that should be allowed. By undertaking an obligation to issue shares at a discounted price at a future date, the assessee incurs an obligation towards remunerating the employees for their services, which is nothing but an expenditure. So this is in effect in the nature of employee cost and therefore is allowable as an expenditure. ESOP shares are not issued with the object of raising capital, rather they are intended to remunerate the employee for their services. So on these three counts, the tribunal held that ESOP expenditure is an allowable expenditure under section 37. The next question that arises, if yes, then how much? And again, if we refer employees taxation, it is exercise price less whatever amount has been recovered that gets taxed. However, here what happens is, what is the period for which the employer should get this deduction? Ideally, the employer should get this deduction over the vesting period, because the vesting period is the time when the services of the employee have been received by the employer. So most logically, vesting period is the period during which the deduction should be allowed. So if, for example, the condition was that you have to remain employed with the company for a period of 3 years, for those 3 years, the employer should ideally amortize this amount of ESOP expenditure in his P&L account. How would you determine that? So the tribunal said the value as on the date of grant less whatever amount is decided to be paid will be considered as the ESOP cost, which will be amortized over the period of the life of the over the vesting period. So that is what the tribunal held. But then there came a question that in terms of taxation, the taxation is with respect to exercise price, and when we are allowing a deduction, it is getting taxed as per grant price. So the tribunal clarified that whatever upward or downward adjustment is required at either year end or in the year of final grant of ESOP will have to be factored into the P&L account of that respective year, and what can be allowed as a deduction is only the amount that is getting taxed as perquisites in the hands of employee. The deduction amount has to be equivalent to the amount that is getting taxed in the hands of employee as perquisite. So the tribunal allowed this. Logically, in absence of this finding of the tribunal, there was a possibility that in the year of exercise of ESOP, this expenditure or income would have been a prior period item, in a fashion that the cost per se did not exactly prior period, but there was a possibility for department to contend that the ESOP expenditure pertained to the vesting period, and any upward or downward adjustment thereto in a future year, in the year in which the employee may have or may not have complied with the vesting condition, ought not to be allowed. But that has been specifically dealt by the tribunal, and it has been said that in the year of vesting, you give a upward or a downward adjustment to this. So this is insofar as, okay, with respect to RSUs also, there is a decision of Goldman Sachs wherein RSU expenditure has also been allowed by the tribunal. Just give me 1 moment. Yeah, I'll come to that. I'll come to that. That's a good question. So that was also in fact tried in one of the case by Hyderabad, this thing, where what happened is they said we'll allow you the deduction, no problem. We'll allow you the deduction over the vesting period, but the point is you have not deducted TDS in each of these years, because TDS you will deduct when? At the time of exercise, which is a future event. The tribunal said that the approach of the assessee is correct in as much as TDS obligation per se arises only in the year in which the option is exercised by the assessee. And therefore, even if TDS is not deducted in each of these years, the expense will have to be allowed in these respective years. And irrespective, in fact, you would not have to go for that year also whether TDS has been deducted or not. Because the TDS obligation did not arise in the year in which the amount was actually debited to the P&L account. Yeah, I'll come to that. So I have one slide on trust, we'll cover that. Trust in fact has much more finer issues with 56 to 10 in place now. Okay, so this decision of ITAT has been affirmed by the Honorable Karnataka High Court, but Karnataka High Court, one peculiar fact that I would want to mention, Karnataka High Court has affirmed only with respect to allowability of expense. It has not dealt with measurement. It has neither affirmed nor denied anything on how do you compute the value of expenditure. So, but today as on date we don't have any decision that has a contrary view, so we can still rely on the Honorable ITAT's decision. In fact, SLP was also filed by the Honorable before the Honorable Supreme Court on this issue, and Honorable Supreme Court has dismissed the SLP of the revenue also. So I think as on date we have finality with respect to expenditure of this particular thing. So that is not provided, but I think that evaluation can be undertaken by any particular, because that is not provided by law, it is coming by virtue of the judgment. Okay, now we come to, this is a small part of it wherein certain relaxations have been provided to startups. So if ESOPs are granted by startups, there is a deferment of tax as well as TDS to the extent of 60 months from the end of the relevant assessment year. So what happens is, if a particular person has been granted ESOP today, who is an employee of an eligible startup, he is not liable to pay tax up to either 60 months from the date or 60 months from the end of the relevant assessment year, or if he leaves employment before that date, or the date on which he sells the shares. So this is a benefit that is granted. Mind you, this benefit is only for startups which are registered under erstwhile TISE provision. So there are two registrations. There are actually not registrations. One is only a DIPP certification, and the other is a registration. So DIPP certification does not entitle you for this benefit. Only if you are registered with IMB, then you are entitled for this benefit. So that is it. Just one small example on this, which I would not get into much detail, but what I am trying to precisely point out is, say for example, Mr. A, who is a resident of ABC, he gets basic salary of this, and the company has decided to allot 5,000 shares of at 10,000 per share as ESOP to Mr. A in the month of May 2026. FMV on the date on which option is exercised is 11,500. So you will compute his taxable income by considering 11,500 minus 10,000. You will compute the entire tax. Once you compute the entire tax, you will get his effective tax rate. That effective tax rate you will multiply by the income that is attributable to ESOPs, and whatever is that income, whatever is that tax gets deferred. It does not get taxed in the subsequent year. So what I am trying to make a point is, the payment of tax has been deferred, the incidence of tax has not been deferred. So it is taxable in the current year, but the payment of tax has to be undertaken 5 years later. So that is an important factor, because otherwise there could be change in slab rates, change in surcharge rates. So your tax would be determined today, payable 5 years later. Yes, company expenses would remain same. Yeah. For with respect to employee, it would be determined on the basis of exercise. because that is the trigger point of taxation. Okay, fine, we'll move on to next. Okay, now we come to trust structure. So how does a typical trust structure work? So there are employees who are beneficiaries of a trust. The employer company would set up a trust, therefore we understand employer is the sponsorer of the trust. There are trustees and employees are the beneficiaries of the trust. Normally the employer company would grant interest-free loan to the trust. The trust would acquire the shares of the employer company by the trust. The trust would acquire the shares of the employer company. Third is, you will have an ESOP plan which governs the grant, vesting conditions, etc., etc. Fourth is, you will have a transfer, distribution of shares on exercise of options or fulfillment of conditions. That is, the trust would transfer the shares to employees. And fifth is, the loan would get repaid to the employer company. So this is how a typical trust structure would work. Now, when we have this structure in place, there are certain challenges that get associated with it. First is there any tax incidence when the company transfers shares at a discount to the trust? And we'll also cover in subsequent slides for employee. So one question that I have in my subsequent slide is, so an employee, fair market value of shares is say 100 rupees, the employee is receiving it at 40 rupees. So 60, whether this 60 can be taxed under 56(2)(10)? Perquisite to hai, that is, first of all, perquisite method etc. is different, but 56(2)(10), whether it can be invoked over and above 56(2)(10)? The answer is no, for two reasons. First, 56, if you refer 56(1), it would state if it is not getting taxed in under other heads, and 56(2) is a subclause of 56(1), in a sense that 56(2) will start subject to the provisions of 56(1), and therefore if it is getting taxed under other heads of income, it cannot be taxed again under 56. That is first argument. Second, you cannot say that it is for inadequate consideration, because the services that the employees are providing is also a valid consideration. There is no method of determining the value of those services, but that is a valid consideration. So therefore 56(2) should not get per se attracted. However, in case of a trust structure, the question arises when the trust receives shares on behalf of employees from the employer for a discounted price, whether 56(2)(10) can be invoked. There is, to my mind, a bright possibility that it can be invoked. There are arguments to state that it should not be invoked, because what the trust receives is also not without consideration or inadequate consideration. The trust receives it with a corresponding obligation towards the employees, and therefore the receipt per se by the trust cannot be subjected to 56(2)(10). So 56, what happens is, trust को एक तरफ shares मिला है, but these shares bringing an equal obligation of giving these shares to the employees who are the beneficiaries. So trust के हाथ में it should not be taxable. However, if we refer the provisions of 56(2)(10) read with the explanation thereto, trust ka there is only one exception, or rather two exceptions. One is charitable trust, which I am not concerned with. The other exception is if the trust is set up wholly and exclusively for relatives of the settler, which in this case does not get complied with. Therefore, there is a quite possibility that the department is in a position to invoke the provisions of 56(2)(10) in the case of trust, where the transaction of ESOP is structured through a trust. Second question is the allowability of expenditure in the hands of the employer company. So the question arises as to what is the period during which this expense should be allowed to the, first of all, whether it should be allowed, and what is the period in which it should be allowed. To my mind, the decision of Biocon Limited should apply with equal force in case of trust, because in essence the vesting conditions are being complied by the employees over the same period in the same fashion as it would have been in the case of a direct allotment of shares, and therefore ideally the employer should be eligible to claim a deduction of the ESOP expenditure in the year over the vesting period in accordance with the provisions of the law. That should not be a problem in view of the decision of Biocon, though Biocon expressly does not anyway deal with this particular aspect of structuring it through a trust, but it should be possible. Third issue, when the trust transfers the shares to beneficiaries, that is, it distributes the shares to employees, is there a capital gain implication? And if yes, whether the same is in case of unlisted shares, whether it is governed by provisions of section 50 CA, that is, whether when the trust transfers the shares to employees, capital gains can be computed in the hands of the trust, and 50 CA value, and the capital gain has to be computed having regard to 50 CA provisions. The answer is, again, it's not clear, because section 47, which considers certain transaction not be regarded as transfer, does not have an explicit mention of any such item. It provides that when a trust is settled, at that time it is covered under 47. So therefore there is no transfer when a sponsor settles a trust. But when a trust in turn distributes to the beneficiary, there is no mention under section 47 whether it is a transfer or not a transfer. No, this is normally a private trust. This is not a charitable trust per se. So we are not looking at section 11 or section 12. Yeah, so for there there are specific provisions under various schedules. If you refer those schedules, those are for superannuation, the recognized provident fund, all of those, gratuity fund. But for ESOP there is no specific that is used for the repayment of loan to the, yeah. So again, there 50C, there is a possibility that it can be invoked, but one possible argument is when the trust distributes the asset to the beneficiary, there should be no taxable incidence per se, because it is a settlement of the obligation that it had, that the trust had, and that there is no transfer per se. But again, not yet tested, but possible to argue. Yeah. Correct. But not specifically in context of ESOPs. Next is ESOP. Okay, so now we covered largely ESOPs. We are now on to ESOP to employees of subsidiaries. Okay, so this can be cross-border also, this can be domestic also. I have covered cross-border so that domestic I think would get covered, but if in case anything is left, we can cover. So normally what happens is you have a holding company, you have a subsidiary company. The holding company would in turn allot shares to the employee of the subsidiary company, and the question arises about, first, taxation in the hands of employee, second, deduction in the hands of holding company, third, deduction in the hands of subsidiary company. So the question is whether it is salary in the hands of employee, because if we refer, it would be too tedious to move back, but if we refer section that we just saw, it is value of any specified security or sweat equity shares allotted or transferred by the former employer or the current employer. So the question is whether equity shares which are allotted not by the employer but by the holding company of the employer would get covered under the present scheme of taxation. The answer is there have been various decisions of the Honorable Supreme Court wherein the Supreme Court held that for taxation as salary, the reward should be linked to employment, and it may not necessarily flow from the same person. This is generally in case of taxation, not with particularly with respect to ESOP, but generally for taxation as salary, what is required is that the reward should be linked to employment. Correct. But directly or indirectly from the employer, from the former employer or the current employer. The question is whether this is from the former employer or the current employer. So there again, possible to litigate, but to my mind, as you say correctly, sir, it should be taxable as salary in view of the fact that, suppose for a moment, let us consider it is not covered under 17(2)(6). 17(2) per se is so widely worded that any benefit that arises from employment gets taxed as perquisites, and therefore normally, even if it is not covered under 17(2)(6), it would get taxed in the hands of employee as salaries, and there are decisions to support that, that even if holding company were to allot shares to the employee of the subsidiary company, it is taxable. So that is, it is perquisites. Again, definitely if it is the holding company is a foreign company, the same should be disclosed in Schedule FA of the employee. Which year? That is a good question. So that was my next question. Which year should this be disclosed as? So see, as on the date of grant, the assessee has no right but merely a hope that he will be entitled to this provided he complies with the vesting conditions. But as on the date of grant, the employee does not receive per se anything, and therefore the date of grant definitely is not the year in which this should be disclosed in Schedule F. Next comes the date of vesting. On the date of vesting, the employee receives a right to exercise his option. So therefore he gets something, and that something is a right. Therefore it is required to be disclosed in Schedule FA to my knowledge, but not as security, but as other assets. That is at least what I would believe, that it is an other asset, other foreign asset, wherein I have a right to claim from the foreign party. So it is as good as a foreign receivable, and therefore as on the date of exercise, it is most prudent to disclose it under Schedule FA under the head other assets. After the date of vesting, I receive the security. When I receive the security, it has to be disclosed in. So I cannot disclose it in securities prior to the date on which I have actually received the securities, because that would be a complete incorrect disclosure. And definitely it is taxable as capital gain at the time of sales, that we have already discussed. Next is whether payment by Indian company to foreign company for share price or cost of share is subject to any TDS. So see, normally what happens is the subsidiary company would reimburse this amount to the foreign company, because ultimately the employee was of the subsidiary company. So subsidiary company, when it reimburses, whether that is subject to TDS, and the answer is it is not subjected to TDS, because it is actually a reimbursement that the subsidiary company is incurring towards the holding company. The holding company has incurred certain cost that is being reimbursed by the subsidiary, and therefore that should not be subjected to TDS. This view again has been affirmed by ITAT in case of Instacart Services Private Limited, Bangalore ITAT. Next is deductibility of expense in the hands of Indian company if it remits the cost of shares to the foreign company. Again, there we have a decision of Honorable ITAT in case of DCIT versus Accenture Services Private Limited, where it has held that the subsidiary is entitled to this deduction because it is the cost that is for its own employees, and therefore this should be allowed. The larger question is, suppose for a moment consider a situation where the F company is an Indian company and it is not recovering the cost of these ESOPs from the subsidiary. Whether the holding company will be entitled to deduction of these expenses. And the question would be whether this is a business expenditure of the holding company is something that will have to be determined. You had decisions in case of SA builders and other cases wherein interest free loan given to subsidiary was considered as a business expenditure of the holding company. So if it can be established with enough nexus that this expenditure pertains to the business of the holding company, possible to argue that the holding company should be allowed a deduction. But again, not a straightforward argument, difficult, because it would all depend on facts. It would be heavily the onus of the holding company to establish that the expenditure was for the purpose of its own business and not for the purpose of subsidiary. So that was the first example wherein we had an inward structure. The second is an outward structure, wherein an Indian company who has a foreign company as a subsidiary is granting ESOP to subsidiary of the foreign company. The question is whether it is taxable in the hands of the employee of the Indian company. In the hands of employee of the, it should be foreign company. So there is an Indian company which is the holding company, there is a foreign company. Foreign company's employee is exercising his employment outside India. Now whether this ESOP is taxable in India for the foreign employee who is working for the foreign company. To my mind, the answer should be no, because for salary to be taxed in India, the employment should be exercised in India. In the present case, since the employment is not per se exercised in India, it should not be taxed in India. And I think for a foreign employee, it is very well possible to contend that the ESOP cannot be taxed in India. His cost of acquisition. Because see, for this particular purpose, they have specifically provided in section 49 that the cost is FMV. Now if this case does not get covered, then it will not be. Next is treatment and taxation of implications of cost incurred by Indian company. Now normally under Ind AS and even otherwise, what happens is this Indian company, there are two ways. Either it can recover the cost from the subsidiary. If it does not recover the cost from the subsidiary, Ind AS would normally require that this amount be classified as cost of investment in the subsidiary, and therefore it will have to be treated accordingly. Allowability of deduction under section 34, as we have already discussed, it is very difficult to contend that the business of the foreign company is the business of the Indian company, because that's in a totally different jurisdiction, and to my mind the Indian company will not be able to claim a deduction under section 34 of the new act. With this we come to an important aspect of lock-in conditions. Normally what happens is, if the company issues ESPPs, this is normally with case of ESPPs, ESOPs also it is possible, but ESPPs normally there are lock-in conditions. That is, there can be two kinds of lock-in conditions. One is that the shares that I grant you today cannot be transferred or cannot be sold by you in the market for a period of 1 year. That is the first kind of lock-in condition. Second is, which is not more of a lock-in condition, but which is that I am allotting you these shares, but if you want to retransfer these shares to me, so suppose if you do not comply with the vesting condition, you should retransfer the shares to me within a period of the vesting period. Say I am allotting the shares to you today, you have to be employed with me for a period of 1 year. If you are not employed with me for a period of 1 year, you have to retransfer these shares to me. So these kind of two conditions are normally there in case of lock-in. Now there are two very critical observations. One is in the case of Infosys Technologies, the Supreme Court observed that if the shares have a lock-in condition, they have no realizable value because I cannot transfer these shares today, and therefore you cannot compute the perquisite valuation. These are all, mind you, these are all decisions prior to 1726 was inserted. So since this is prior to 1726 insertion, there was no method of valuation, and the Supreme Court, in absence of a valuation mechanism, held that since the shares had a lock-in, the market value could not be determined because they are not marketable. The Supreme Court analyzed section 222B of the income tax, which defines fair market value to mean the value that the shares would fetch in the open market. The Supreme Court said there is no fair market value. How will we determine the market value? And on that basis, they concluded that it cannot be taxed. In the present day, for listed shares at least, the fair market value is clearly defined to be the price that the share has in the open market. One can argue possibly that this share is different from that share because that share does not carry a lock-in, this share carries a lock-in. But again, only time will tell whether that argument is correct. So that is one possibility that you have. But this argument can especially play of, it can be of some importance where the shares are not allotted to an employee, but say to a director who is not an employee, or to a consultant, which would not get governed by salary but by section 28. In those cases, it is still possible to contend that the fair market value is the market value in the open market, and if there is no market value in the open market, the valuation cannot be undertaken. But for listed shares that are allotted with lock-in, this should not apply. Unlisted shares, unlisted shares, the valuation is to be determined by a merchant banker. So if the merchant banker can give some discounting factor because of this lock-in, that is one way of looking at it. Okay, we'll just rush through these questions. I have how much time? 5-7 minutes. 5-7 minutes. No problem. Taxation of ESOP given to directors who are not employees. Whether they will be governed by salary, the answer is definitely no, because salary is when you are an employee. So the question is, how will it be governed? Whether it will be governed by section 28, if it is in the nature of business profession, yes. If no, then whether it will be governed by section 56, the answer is yes. So either section 28 or section 56, depending on the facts of each case, you will have to determine. And again, here, as I said, the arguments of 222B would have to be factored into. Next is taxability of stock options exercised by the legal hire in case of death of an employee. And we had Bhadresh Bhai this morning, informing us that there are CBDT circulars which would say that if a salary is received by the employee, if certain payments are received by the legal hire of the employee, they cannot be taxed in the hands of the legal hire. So whether those arguments can come into picture here as well, the answer is yes, because for taxing as income from salary, it has to be then there has to exist an employer-employee relationship. Secondly, what happens is normally with respect to ESOPs, the tax on these ESOPs is sometimes borne by the employer. The question is, what happens with respect to this tax? Whether this is included as perquisite? The answer is no. Tax paid on non-monetary perquisite is specifically exempt in the hands of employee under section 1010C of the erstwhile act. Okay, one more aspect is taxability on compensation for loss in fair value. Now, this has come up due to this Flipkart issue, when what had happened is Flipkart issued certain ESOPs to its employees. Thereafter, the holding Flipkart company got merged into some other company, due to which the value of the shares fell down. And the employees were compensated for this loss in value. The question arose whether this is taxable as salary or capital gains, or not at all taxable. The courts held that, so there are one High Court decision, one tribunal decision, which held that this is taxable as capital gains, because what the employee got was a right to shares, and due to this right, if he has surrendered this right and he is getting something, it should be treated as capital gains However, in absence of determination of cost, earlier you had that argument of BC Srinivasan Shetty, now you are section 55, you will have to consider the cost as nil. Then the question is, will section 56 to 10 apply when an employee receives shares for inadequate, that we have discussed. Okay. Reporting of ESOP if FMV exceeds 10 lakh in SFT. From an employer's perspective, say I have issued ESOP shares worth rupees 12 lakhs, the FMV is 12 lakhs, to an employee for 2 lakhs. The consideration that I receive from is only 2 lakhs. Whether I am required to report it under SFT, because SFT says receipt of consideration from a particular person for issue of shares in excess of 10 lakhs. To my mind, the answer is no. SFT is receipt of consideration, and in this case, since the consideration per se is only 2 lakhs, ideally this where the consideration received is less than rupees 10 lakhs, it should not be reported. There are contrary views. There is a view that with respect to the balance, the employee has provided services, and therefore that is also consideration, and if you don't disclose it, there is a possible exposure that you carry under 56 to 10. But all that having said and done, I think it should not be disclosed. Next, we have already discussed with respect to allowability of ESOP expenses where TDS is not deducted in the year of accounting. This is the decision Bharat Financial Inclusion Limited, wherein they said that TDS is not required to be deducted. With this, we move on to the last part of this, which I have already largely discussed, is stock appreciation rights. So stock appreciation rights, if you prior to 2000, when you did not have 1726, you had one Mumbai ITAT decision which had held that it was taxable as salary, which was overturned by the Honorable Bombay High Court, stating that for taxing under the Income Tax Act there has to be a specific provision, and in absence of a specific provision it cannot be taxed, and therefore stock appreciation rights, since they were not specifically taxable, ideally cannot be taxed under Income Tax Act. That was held by Bombay High Court. Similarly, Supreme Court also in Bharat v Patel held that prior to 2000 stock appreciation rights could not be taxed. It analyzed the amendment of then 1723A, which was then replaced by 1726, to hold that post 2000 the stock appreciation rights would be taxable as salary. And then you have this Chennai ITAT decision, which is a recent decision wherein stock appreciation rights are held to be specifically as revenue expenditure and taxable under 1726. Now here one important question, and we end this session, is whether 1726 or stock appreciation rights that we are discussing, whether it can be considered as bonus for the purpose of section 43B. And there you have multiple decisions of the Honorable ITAT which have held that bonus would normally mean only statutory bonus and not voluntary bonus. That is one argument that one can take. Even if that argument does not sail through, I think stock appreciation rights is distinct from bonus. Bonus is something that is linked to performance. Stock appreciation rights is something that is linked to vesting conditions normally, and therefore stock appreciation rights cannot be equated with bonus, and therefore 43B cannot be invoked with respect to payments, that cash payments made for stock appreciation rights. I think with this I'll close. If we have any questions, and if the chair permits, I'll conclude.
Now I request Shyam to give him a well-deserved performance.
Thank you, C.A. Jigar Mehta, today's learned speaker for second session, for such a detailed seminar on taxation on salaries and tax impact on ESOPs. The detailed presentation, a lot of illustrations, practical examples, we have covered the topic very well and in detail. It will help the members to advise their clients on tax saving strategies on salaries as well as tax impact on ESOPs and structuring ESOPs. Request all the members to present a huge round of applause.